Hello and welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to Fallout New Vegas, where we're going back to basics, where we're going all caveman mode on anything and punching stuff with our knuckles. Not with our bare hands. I might make a video on that if you guys would like to see just bare hands, how good are they? But this time we're going to be talking about all of the knuckles, sort of. There's a couple other things that look sort of like knuckles as well in this game. But this will be the brass knuckles, spike knuckles, and the unique spike knuckles, since technically they're all sort of the same family, kind of. They all have their own stat lines and everything, so it's a little bit different. But even without the perk jury rigging, you can actually fix all these together with one another. So if you wanted to, you could fix your spike knuckles up with brass knuckles without even needing a perk, which is pretty awesome. The brass knuckles are probably going to be one of the very first unarmed weapons that you find. They're not going to be your first because you start out with your bare hands. So I guess that counts as one right away. And you may not find it before you find maybe boxing gloves or boxing tape. Boxing tape I tend to find first, but brass knuckles are usually a very quick second to find. So for the base stats of the brass knuckles, this one requires 25 unarmed, which is not super high. I mean, you're probably going to go for that if you're going with an unarmed build anyway, so getting that right at the start isn't a big deal. This only requires 2 strength, so basically anybody can wield it. This one does pretty good damage per hit at 18. That's not bad for an early game weapon. This one does 37 damage per second, which is pretty good by itself too. You can attack fairly fast with brass knuckles. This one has 18 crit damage, which is what you would kind of expect for a weapon like this. It has a 1x crit modifier, so nothing crazy there. Only costs 18 action points to use. Brass knuckles are actually a really good action point weapon. Most unarmed and melee weapons are actually pretty good for this, at least one-handed weapons. Sometimes the two-handed weapons cost a lot. Faster melee or unarmed options tend to have very low action point cost, so they're really good for a VATS build. Plus you do get access to all of the different unarmed and melee attacks based on your unarmed or melee. At least with unarmed, you do unlock different ones, like you can do cross attacks or uppercuts whenever you're in VATS, which will allow you to have a little bit more damage overall, which is pretty cool, but it will cost extra action points depending on what you're using. These ones only weigh 1, so they're incredibly lightweight as you would kind of expect them to be, and this has a 200 health pool on it, which is pretty good. That's actually really high compared to most early game melee or unarmed weapons, besides maybe like boxing tape, which I think is like 350. Brass knuckles do not break very fast, which is really good for an unarmed or melee build, which you're probably going to be speccing into both if you're taking one or the other. So getting a pair of brass knuckles early on is really, really nice. You can usually beat through most of the early game enemies, no problem. And there's a couple of perks that we should probably talk about with this too that make it even stronger. Slayer is one of the best melee and unarmed perks, and probably just one of the best perks in the entire game, as it just allows you to attack 30% faster with everything. That's really good. You can also have Piercing Strike, which is one of the best perks in the game too, as it allows you to have 15 or minus 15 damage threshold towards any target. So you're just completely ignoring basically every light armor in the game and almost all medium armors in the game whenever you're punching or stabbing somebody. And it's only going to be heavy armors that kind of resist your hits. And even then, if it's like metal armor, you're still going to go right through it. So it's going to have to be even tankier than that in order for it to actually stop you. That's really strong. Oh, Super Slam is another really strong perk too, because it allows you to just knock down enemies. And if you can knock down enemies and they're not fighting back and it's a one-on-one fight, it becomes a real easy fight for you just to keep punching them when they're on the ground. So that's just a strong thing with melee and unarmed in general. For the pros of the brass knuckles, and I guess the spike knuckles too, since we're sort of talking about both, these all kind of fit for the pros and cons of each of these. The pros are that this one does do really high damage and pretty good damage per second in an early game. It also has really good item health, and all of these count as sneak-in items. So you can sneak these into any sort of holdout area, which they're very good, especially the spike knuckles. They're really strong in holdout areas, since even if you're not going for the unique version of them, or you don't know where it is, then like even just picking up a pair of spike knuckles is surprisingly strong, even if you're not spec'd into melee or unarmed at all. These ones also have pretty low action point cost, so they're really good on a VATS build. Major con though to these weapons is that they do kind of fall off compared to other unarmed and melee weapons. They're not terrible by any means in terms of the fall off, but they're not as strong as certain other weapons can be. For all of this, I would put the brass knuckles into C tier. I think that they're a really good starting game weapon, and they can be a pretty good holdout weapon, but you will probably replace them with some of the other unarmed weapons as it goes on. Moving on to the spike knuckles, they require 50 unarmed and 3 strength, so more unarmed and more strength. However, you can still get spike knuckles pretty early on into the game, so finding them is not very difficult. Raiders can often have them too, and it can be really, really nice to find a pair of spike knuckles early on. This one does 25 damage per hit, which is pretty good. This one has 59 damage per second, which is also really good. This one does 25 crit damage, same as normal damage, has a 1x crit modifier, nothing crazy there. Costs 19 action points to use, 1 more point than brass knuckles, so they're usually going to be basically the same for you regardless of how you build, whether you're building for VATS or not with your unarmed build. They're both going to be pretty good. Brass Knuckles are slightly better, but only slightly in terms of overall action points. This one only weighs 1 as well, and this one has 300 item HP, which is really high for an early game weapon. 300 item HP does take a while to go through, especially for the Spike Knuckles. You're probably not going to be breaking them anytime soon. And even if you do, it's not that huge of a deal, because if you can find a vendor that's selling Brass Knuckles, you can just fix up your Spike Knuckles with them. And you will probably find some raiders that either have Spike Knuckles that you can fix these with, or Brass Knuckles. So these are extremely durable, just like the Brass Knuckles are. Same type of pros and cons go for this weapon too. They don't fall off as hard as Brass Knuckles, so they are a little bit better. And I would probably put the Spike Knuckles a tier higher than the Brass Knuckles, up into B tier. They're all around a very solid weapon. They do tend to fall off later into the game, but not so much later, at least for an unarmed character. It's just that a lot of your weapons later with unarmed are pretty strong, and a lot of them you kind of can sneak into areas, which makes them even better than something like this. So it's kind of like on a scale, but this is still a very, very good weapon, especially in the early game. It'd probably be even higher in the early game. And then we move on to the unique version called Love and Hate. This one you can find on a raider that is just north of Good Springs. You do have to kill this raider in order to get these, or I guess break them off of them and then steal them off the ground or something. I guess that would also count. And this raider is pretty strong. The raiders around there are pretty strong in general, because one of the raiders, at least one of the raider leaders, has reinforced metal armor, and he's also got a trail carbine, which hits pretty hard in the early game. This one, the Spike Knuckles hit pretty hard, and they also have plasma grenades, and they're wearing combat armor, which is all kind of a bad scenario early on in the game. But if you are strong enough to get through the Cazadors and go over there and fight them, then you can get a really, really strong early game weapon. So Love and Hate also requires 50 unarmed and 3 strength, same as regular Spike Knuckles. This one does 30 damage per hit. This one does 67 damage per second, so quite a bit more damage per second than the other options that we've talked about. Has 30 crit damage, which is fine. 1 times crit modifier, which is fine. Also costs 19 action points, the same as the Spike Knuckles. Weighs 1 as well. And this one also has 300 item health, so it takes a very long time for this to break. This is probably one of the best early game options that you can get in terms of unarmed and in terms of melee. You can also get Chance's Knife by here, which I would say is a little bit better, mostly because of perks helping that one out more so. But in the early game, assuming you don't have any perks for either of them, they're both pretty comparable to one another, where they both have high damage. They're both pretty fast. They're both fairly durable. This one's actually even more durable, and they can both count as sneak-in weapons, which are probably 2 of the best weapons that you can sneak into areas. So Love and Hate, I would actually move up a tier from the Spike Knuckles, going up to A tier. They are a very solid option in the early game, a pretty solid option into the mid game, and still not a bad option into the late game. They do kind of still fall off compared to some of the late game unarmed weapons that you can get and that you can sneak into areas still, but they are among some of the best sneak-in weapons, and they still are one of the best early game weapons, just hands down. So in conclusion, should you use the Brass Knuckles or Spike Knuckles? I would say yeah, absolutely, if you're playing New Vegas. Even if you don't plan on going with an unarmed or a melee build, they're not that bad to take just for a sneak-in build, because even with just the base stats that they have, they're still pretty good. And you may not have guns or energy weapons, or if you're going with an explosive build, explosives just aren't that great for sneak-in weapons in general, because of all the problems that explosives can have. These might actually be a really good alternative for you to keep on you for any length of time, especially if you're worried about breaking your guns or anything like that, or you're running low on money. You don't really have to worry about breaking things like the Brass or Spike Knuckles, because you're likely going to find another pair of Brass or Spike Knuckles, or be able to buy a pair super, super cheap from vendors, and then just fix up yours in the early game. And then, like I said, Love and Hate, it can actually carry you quite a ways in the game, and is probably one of the better early game options just in general. So thank you guys so very much for watching this. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye, everyone!